right, well, thank you all so much for joining us for tonight's program with selling author Brian Freeman, who is discussing his new thriller, Robert Ludlum's The Bourne Vendetta, a Jason Bourne novel, in conversation with author Scott Shepard in this installation of Author Hour in Massachusetts. First, let me introduce Scott. Scott Shepard is a veteran TV writer, producer, and showrunner with years of experience running network series. His production and screenwriting credits include The Equalizer, Miami Vice, The Outer Limits, Haven, and Quantum Leap. One of my all-time favorites, Quantum Leap. Born in New York and raised in LA, he currently teaches TV writing at the University of Texas in Austin. Scott is also the author of the Austin Grant of Scotland Yard mystery series, whose most recent novel, Should I Fall, earned a starred review in Library Journal. And Brian Freeman
good job,
is
Scott.
Good job, Scott. Brian Freeman is the best-selling author of over 25 novels, including the Jonathan Stride and Frost Easton series. His Audible original, The Deep, Deep Snow, hit the New York Times audio bestseller list. His novels have won the International Thriller Writers Award and the Macavity Award, and has been finalists for the Gold Dagger, the Edgar, the Anthony, and the Barry Awards. And in 2019, Brian was selected as the author to continue Robert Ludlum's famous Jason Bourne series and has now released multiple best-selling Bourne novels. Folks, let's give Brian and Scott a big virtual round of applause for being with us tonight. And Brian and Scott, you can take it away. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Robert. I hear
All
that
right. Well, and everyone should know that Scott and I are good friends, and so this is for us is going to feel like kind of an ordinary conversation. So, but I guess we don't usually have people spying on us as we chat. But that's fine.
In your Bourne world, maybe we do.
True. Yeah. No, that's a good point.
All those chats we've had and continue to have, maybe they've been Bourne and Treadstone, and everybody's listening, right?
Well, I will tell you that I had the good fortune to give a presentation actually at the Central Intelligence Agency just a couple of weeks ago, and I walked away with some very nice CIA swag here. So I was a little concerned when I checked into the hotel that maybe I should be going around looking for bugs and cameras.
Now, do you have a copy of the new book, or is it? I only see.
I don't. It does not actually come out until January 14th. But the Bourne Vendetta is my 6th in the Jason Bourne series, and very excited to have this book out in the world and in readers' hands.
Well, probably obviously the easiest place to start is, do you want to just tell people when people ask you about the newest book, what do you say about it? What's the best way to describe it, would you say?
Yeah, well, a couple things. I mean, obviously there have been a lot of iterations of Jason Bourne over the years. I mean, you had the Robert Ludlum 3 novels. You had Eric von Lustbader, who did a dozen novels after Mr. Ludlum passed away, and then of course you've got all of the wonderful Matt Damon movies. Although I should point out, I may be one of the few people who remember that. Yes, long before Matt Damon was Jason Bourne, Richard Chamberlain was Jason Bourne, exactly, with Jacqueline Smith of Charlie's Angels fame as Marie St. Jacques. So it was a huge honor for me to be selected to take over the Bourne series. I was a huge Ludlum and Bourne fan growing up. One of my all-time favorite thrillers was The Bourne Identity, and I would have first read that novel when I was all of 17 years old back in 1980. And if you had told me back then that some 40 years later books would be coming out with my name and Robert Ludlum's name on the cover, I would have thought you were crazy. So it really has been a terrific ride these past several years, kind of diving into Ludlum's world and Bourne's world. The Bourne Vendetta, I said it's my 6th novel. I've got a couple different series out there. I've got my Jonathan Stride series set up in Minnesota, and I've got 11 books in that series. Whenever I'm working on a long-running series, I'm always trying to write the books in such a way that readers can dive in anywhere, because I'm always conscious of the fact that that asking readers to go all the way back to the beginning in a series and kind of work their way forward, that's a big ask. So I like to write the books in such a way that every novel is going to give you a full, rich understanding of the characters, and you can really dive in. And my hope is you read a later book in the series and you feel like you fall in love with the characters and you want to go back and kind of see how the character reached that point in their lives. And I think the Bourne Vendetta is sort of a particularly good place to meet my iteration of Jason Bourne, and to really get to know him as a hero and a character, and understand kind of the world that I'm trying to create with Bourne. Because when I started out on this series, what I told the folks at Putnam and the Ludlum estate is, I didn't want to try to build on what had come before, because over the course of 40 years, again, there have been so many different visions of Bourne. I wanted to be very true, very authentic to Ludlum's original character from the Bourne identity, but then take that character, drop him down into the present with all new plots and all new sub-characters around him. And that's really what you find in all these books, and that's what you find in the Bourne Vendetta.
Well, I think having read all 6 of them, and knowing there's more to come, I do think this is a particularly good one in the sense that it has an element, for lack of a better description, a spy case of the week in it, right? There's a mission, there's
Yes.
something we're all looking for, which is this thing called the files, and I won't go any farther than that. But what's really interesting is a lot of people that you've met in the previous books are also looking for the same thing that Bourne is, and you're able to actually introduce people who might be reading this as their first. It's a great place to jump in, because you get to understand who some of these people in your world of Jason Bourne's, what their characters are like, how they relate to Bourne, and then you can sort of backfill just enough. But if you've been on the continuous journey, as I've been, and a lot of these readers, I'm sure, who are joining us today, you feel like you're just moving into the next step. You don't feel like you're repeating anything, which I think is really important.
Yes, that's always kind of the delicate balancing act in series books, is you want to provide enough background to give readers that rich understanding of the characters, but not so much that series readers are like, oh yes, I know that, let's move it along. So,
well, I've always talked about, like, my publishers, like, the book that was just mentioned, the Should I Fall book, was a sequel to the other one. And my first question to my editor and to the publishers was, does this could it be seen as a standalone? Yes.
Right.
Seem like it's a continuation? Yes. So the idea being that you're not boring the people who've read the one before, but you're also fulfilling some of their expectations for the reward for reading the other one. And like you say, the other ones can sort of start. Look, one of the things I've loved, and I've said this to you numerous times about the Bourne books, and I think for people who are just maybe jumping into these for the first time, I made it akin to what I thought was so magnificent that the James Bond producers did when they brought Daniel Craig to do the James Bond with Casino Royale. They kind of reinvented or reinvigorated Bond, right? Very true. Yeah. The form. I had read all the Ian Fleming books growing up, and Daniel Craig's James Bond is arguably the closest to the character that was actually in the novels. A little tougher. Right. Than certainly Roger Moore was, tongue in cheek, but it had all those things, but he really kind of rebooted it and made it his own journey. And I feel like that's what you've done with your Jason Bourne. Everything is backstory and everything lines up with what Ludlum intended, but he's on his own journey. And I feel it just feels like you've pushed it and brought it into the 21st century as opposed to the late 20th century, 19th century.
Yeah. And that's exactly right. Is that, as I was looking at taking over the series, I felt that if you go all the way back to the Bourne identity, again, that literally came out in 1980. It was a product of the Watergate and the Vietnam era, a lot of kind of conspiracy thinking, a lot of distrust of government, and that was the sort of the milieu in which Ludlum was writing his novels. And so, in my mind, you can't really try to bring those two together in actual fact. I guess Liam Neeson can somehow pull it off, but not too many folks looking for action heroes in their mid 70s. So I needed to make Bourne younger. I needed to make him fresher and more modern again. but it was kind of interesting because as I started thinking about the plots for my Bourne novels, looking back at the environment in which Ludlum was writing, I was seeing a lot of parallels between where the society was back then and where society is today, and this whole nature of conspiracy thinking and distrust of government and the deep state and all these kinds of things. It really seemed like it was kind of a natural thing to lift up this hero that was so much a product of that environment and drop him down into the current era.
Well, but now it was spy. I mean, there weren't even cell phones when Ludlum was writing.
Right.
Right. Computers, none of the stuff that it's so funny. I mean, doing a lot of television shows and everything for years, the first part of my career, there was no cell phones, no computers. And it's like now, how would modern television shows, modern things exist without cell phones, without computers? It also gives them a fallback to go into, well, we can go into the big computer room and we can kind of try and figure out, we can look everything up on a really boring screen. But at the same time, I think, a lot of people, like you mentioned, a lot of people aren't even familiar with the Ludlum novels because they really are 4 decades ago. I think most people do, they're mostly familiar with Bourne from the, from the Matt Damon movies.
Yeah.
I would sort of say the thing about those movies, because they were 2 hours, just adrenaline rushes, right? They were first and foremost huge action films. Secondly, really into the spy world, and all that and all the trappings that go with that. And third, character, right? And it was interesting. Character probably was the least in 2 hours they needed to do, especially with a character who didn't know who the hell he was, right? So that was a bit. What I think has been more, what I feel like what the Bond movies did with Daniel Craig and what you've done with your novels, and I've said this to you before, is they flipped that in reverse. It feels like it's first and foremost, he's a great character, great characters around him. Secondly, the spiral, which you just talked about, is something that's really interesting. And then the action comes because he's a man of action. But because you're writing a novel, it's really the reason you keep coming back is how many different ways can you kill somebody? Well, you have figured that out very well. But at the same time, I think it's really who can he trust? Who's he in love with? What's he left behind? That's what I feel like is the most, am I right? And that's the first place you kind of think what's most important?
Yeah, I really think that is what has made Bourne such an enduring, iconic character. It's that nature of his psychological complexity as a character. I mean, the Matt Damon movies, I mean, they're fantastic movies. I love them. As action movies, they are absolutely superb. I think that Bourne as a character, doesn't really come out in the movies in the way that he does in the books. I mean, ultimately, in the movies, it really is focused on the adrenaline rush, which is what you can do in a 2-hour film. But what I think Ludlum did so well was make Bourne just a very psychologically interesting character, because I mean the whole concept of this man who has lost his memory and is trying to sort of really on an existential level discover who he is, not just in terms of his missing past, but just the kind of man he is, and can he be a moral man and have the skills he does and do the things that he is forced to do. For me, I always thought when I first was asked to take over the Bourne series, I was honestly a little bit surprised, only to the extent that my own genre really was not in the action side of things. And I really write more psychological, emotional mysteries. But I think what Putnam and the Ludlum estate were looking for was someone who could bring out the depth of Bourne's character. And that's really what I've tried to do in the series, is to have Bourne as a hero change, grow, evolve based on what's happening to him in the books. And I think that's what keeps him interesting as a character.
Well, it's interesting as a parallel, and if people haven't seen it, I don't know if you've seen it. I don't know if we talked about it, but on Peacock, Day of the Jackal, which is on right now, right? With Eddie Redmayne, fantastic actor. And the show I think is really good. And what's interesting is, again, based on a very classic tale from the 70s, which was really Edward Fox playing this kind of, unknown, quiet person who was very skilled, didn't know much about his character. It was all about him trying to kill Charles de Gaulle. In the space of 10 episodes in this new thing, Eddie Redmayne starts off, it's very technically, very modern, very cool, but it's really watching it in these 10 episodes. What I found fantastic was watching you know, like you say, the character they turned the Jackal into as being a three-dimensional character who was trying to keep one part of his life away from the other part of his life, trying to come to grips with it, and explaining where some of this came from. And because it was a longer period of 10 hours versus a 2-hour book or one book or a 2-hour movie, it allowed the time to go do that. And even though each one of your books peels another part of the onion, so to speak, of Jason Bourne. When I think people who've read him up to this point are going to feel finding out more and more and more how he became who he is and what does he want. And like you say, if this is your first, venture into your Bourne books, I think everybody's going to want to go back and read the first 5 to catch up and then keep going.
Right. It's interesting. I did an interview a couple of weeks ago with folks at Writer's Digest, and the topic was this whole concept of legacy writing, of carrying on the work of authors who have passed away. And obviously we have this with Ludlum, same with Tom Clancy, same with Vince Flynn, sort of the primary examples. I thought it was interesting because the interviewer had been talking to a couple of the other legacy writers, and they had a very different philosophy of it, which I really appreciated learning about. They had been telling her that their approach to the character was to keep that character absolutely the same from book to book. So they did not want the character to grow, evolve, change. They wanted this hero to remain the same in each of the novels, which is a perfectly reasonable approach. And I always say that in a lot of cases, particularly when it comes to series books, readers want you to write a book that is completely different and yet absolutely the same. Right. So they may or may not want to see the evolution of the character. They may want that stability of knowing, well, whenever I pick up this book, this hero, he's going to be exactly the way he's always been. But for me, and again, that's a perfectly reasonable approach. For me, I just find it more interesting, more real, more three-dimensional to have series characters grow and change based on what's happening to them in the books. And I think that keeps them from getting stale. I always say that series books don't generally fall apart because the authors run out of plots. They fall apart because the characters get stale and they seem like they're the same every time. So that's what for me. And again, Bourne is such an interesting, complex character because of having lost his memory. There's such a rich vein of drama that comes out of that I feel like you have to allow that character to evolve with each of the books.
Well, I also think that's something that, certainly in the world I come from, television, and also having read, thousands of mysteries and thrillers my entire life. I mean, you look, usually you and I are chatting in my library that's got thousands of books, and I have people I've read 20, 30 books by, and the reason series television is series television, a series of detective things, is it is watching the character progress over the years, getting older, losing, living, loving, all these kind of things. When and television has kind of caught up with that, in the last 10, 15 years with the streaming, right? I mean, Breaking Bad, right? One of these things that literally one of the most successful of those shows of all time, the writer would tell you what he wanted to do is he wanted to take Mr. Chips, right, and turn him into Scarface. So you know where you start, you know where you end. Took 6 years to do that. And then the individual episodes were kind of one step in terms of hopefully coming away with a beginning, middle, and end of every episode, but one step closer to that. And I know when we're plotting television series, and in fact, one of the things you and I and my friend Dan Pine, another terrific writer, TV writer for years, and not movie writer and novelist, we've been, we've adapted, right? Your Serena, your Jonathan Stride books, and we're trying to put those together. One of the things we were able to do, saying, what do we want to accomplish in the first year with Jonathan Stride and Serena? Where do you want to start them at the start? Where do you want to find them at the end? And I kind of feel that's the way, to me, if I'm doing any plotting at all, it's like, where do I want my character on page 1? Where do I want my character on page 350, right?
Right.
Then you kind of find a plot that allows you to be able to do that in a most surprising way. Is that one of the ways to kind of attack these books?
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, I always, people ask, where do you get your ideas? How does the book take shape? And for me, when you're talking about a series novel, I always want to start with the characters. I always want to, analyze where the characters are at this point in their lives and what, what issues they're dealing with. And then I develop a plot that sort of forces them to deal with that aspect of their lives. So ultimately the plot emerges out of kind of where the characters are, and the things go hand in hand. So for example, in my most recent Jonathan Stride novel is called The Zero Night. And when I was thinking through the plot of The Zero Night, I started with where Stride and Serena were as characters. And Serena is Stride's wife, another detective. She's also an alcoholic who came out of an abusive relationship with her mother. And I was thinking about Serena as a character and thinking that whenever her mother passed away, she was going to have to deal with a lot of emotional baggage that she hadn't faced in her life, and it was likely to put her sobriety at risk. And so I then developed a plot that not only involved the fact that her mother passes away, but ends up having Serena have to deal with a case that involves a teenage girl that was struggling with a difficult relationship with her mother. So all these things kind of came together in such a way that it not only creates a mystery with a lot of twists and turns, but it also forces the character to confront these things and to grow and change during the course of the investigation.
Right. No, exactly. I mean, and I feel like that is something, yeah, I mean, I was aspiring to saying, it's also in a longer running series of things too. You can actually have surprises where you can take the time to paint a character, and especially in the spy world, right? Where you think they're good, and can be even not in just one book, and then you suddenly realize they're treacherous on the other side. The other thing we've learned that's happened, is that, I mean, I was just finishing the last day, I'm behind as always on most novels, except for yours. I think I've read all 24, 20, 80 or books or whatever over the last few years. But I was reading one of the Harry Hole, Joe Nesbo books, right? I think like the book over the years. And I get to the end, not saying, one of the characters was suddenly blown away by a serial killer that you'd find him fallen for like 10 books. And I'm going, oh my God, that's unbelievable that you can do that, So talk about not changing things up. The great thing is you can make, this is something that I think modern storytelling has allowed us to be able to kind of go do, and continuing characters. Otherwise, if you are doing the same thing over, it does become formulaic and a little less boring, I think, right?
Yes. Yeah, I think that's right. I also am, I can't help but be impressed with Joe Nesbo that he was able to get away naming his hero Harry Hole. So
but I was told that it was pronounced Harry Hole.
Yeah, sure.
Well, exactly. I don't know. Be interesting. I know they're doing a television series for Netflix like next year. We'll see what they call him.
We'll see what they call him. Exactly. The other thing I think is that's interesting, particularly in doing things like the Bourne novels, is finding plots and threads that feel kind of ripped from the headlines, and that's something that I always enjoy, because it gives an immediacy to it for the reader. You can see behind me my most recent standalone thriller, Break Every Rule. I think folks will read that and they'll hear a lot of echoes of the whole Jeffrey Epstein saga in that book. And I try to do that with the Bourne novels as well, to come up with themes and ideas that are very topical. And sometimes it surprises me. I mean, the Bourne Shadow was the previous Bourne novel that came out over the summer, and so I wrote that more than a year and a half ago, and yet it deals with a French election in which the right wing is threatening to take over, and there's an attempted assassination of a presidential candidate. And I was rereading it over the summer, going, wow, what happened here? Somebody's been spying on my books. So and in the Bourne Vendetta, it deals with kind of the whole concept of how AI can be used in ways that people may not expect, and so I deal with something that's very topical, which is this concept of hacking that's going on, and the Chinese in particular that have been hacking databases, and I fold in the AI element of that. When you're talking about hacking databases, it's not just the data that becomes a concern, but when you overlay this new technology concept, that the AI can sift through this data and find threads and commonalities of all these different, millions of data elements that a human being's never going to see, and so they can find hitmen and thieves and pedophiles and all these things via the database, even if there's nothing that you'd necessarily see in the data itself. And so that being able to have access to those files is such a powerful tool for good or for bad. And that's really kind of the heart of the Bourne Vendetta, is that all these different people are trying to get hold of this software to be able to analyze these hacked databases. And everybody has their own hidden agenda, including Bourne. So.
Well, one of the things also I think that's so great about your books, and it started, maybe Ludlum and Bond were the first ones, and maybe it's somewhat to the spy field, because I think of the Bond books and I think of the original Ludlum books, I think of Daniel Silva, and I think of your Bourne book is the travel log, sort of thing of it all, which is like literally, it's almost that, I know Daniel Silva does it too, where they put with this Gabriel Allon books, it's like literally each chapter is the place he's at. And it allows you, whether it's like, oh, that's the book that was in the Vatican, that's the book that's in Israel, that's the book that's in the United States. It used to be the same thing with Bond, Live and Let Die was in New Orleans, For Your Eyes Only is up in the Swiss Alps. And it feels like each book has its own place that either you, through wish fulfillment, want to take us, you describe. You want to talk a little bit about like how you decide to choose, where is it places you want to visit, is places you have. It's like, what feel, because I think it's a great character. And I know I've seen a couple people have said one of the great things about your writing is you feel like you are living in the place that you set things in, right? I mean, you and I were talking this morning, your Frost Eaton book, which takes place in San Francisco, and me having gone to school up there. And I said, I know Brian writes someplace where he just researches if he's never been. But I said, these 3 books were so specific to San Francisco. And I spent years up there, and I'm going, no. And you told me that you used to live, I forgot you used to live in San Mateo. But you want to talk a little bit about, how sense of place is for you?
Yeah, I mean, I think sense of place is so important for thrillers. I mean, I think that it really enriches the drama. And so I always want to give readers kind of a you are there feel with every place, and that they feel as if they've been dropped down into the scene and they can hear it and touch it and taste it and smell it happening all around them. It to me, I actually call it the 6 senses of place. It's not just the idea that you want to have the physical sensations of being somewhere, but place has such an additional layer of meaning for people. I mean, it evokes emotions. It evokes wonder and fear. It brings memories to the surface. It connects you with other parts of your life. If you can capture that about a place, then I think it's going to create that unforgettable setting. And I know for me, it's always strange that when I visit places where I have set scenes in the books, there's this odd sort of ghost echo of the characters, and I can feel the characters kind of coming to life. I can hear them and feel them and see them in the settings. And for me, Bourne has always been a very international character and series, and so you end up with a lot of international settings. I always, particularly like in the Stride books, I always want to be able to be everywhere where I'm setting a chapter, because I want to kind of scope it out the way a film director would, and really sense exactly how it feels to be there. The hard part is that's a little hard to do when you're doing 2 Bourne books in a year, and you've got Reykjavik and Estonia and Paris and all these other places. If I could easily spend all of my writing time off visiting the places that Bourne is going to go. So on one hand, I tend to use a lot of locations I've been, so at least I have kind of a connection to those areas. And then you just do a lot of research. I did a book called I Remember You about 3 years ago, and it's sort of a Michael Crichton-esque thriller. A large part of the book is based in Boston, and I've really only been to Boston a small number of times in my life, and I haven't been there in quite a few years. But I did sort of exhaustive research about Boston, and one of the things that I was proudest of when I Remember You came out was how many Bostonians wrote to me and said, "Oh, you nailed the city." And I think of Bostonians as being a pretty finicky audience about how their city is going to be portrayed. So I love the fact that I Remember You got a passing grade from the Boston folks.
Well, you know, it's so funny because collecting a lot, you know, I mean, to me, yes, you know, between you and the John Sanford books, it's like my whole knowledge of Minnesota is like, you know, from reading your two series of books, right? You know, in terms of that. But like, if I want to go to Louisiana, I read James Lee Burke. You know, if I want to go to Maine, I read John Connolly. You know, it's things like that, and setting things like we spent a lot of time going to Hawaii on vacation on the Big Island, and for years I wanted to write about it. And I'm in writing my last novel, I'm going, God, I need to go to somewhere nice. Let me write about that. And because I chose that place and chose the Big Island of Hawaii, knew that culture, it actually presented characters and plot ideas that I wouldn't have thought of if I hadn't decided to set that there. So I think it's sort of, you know, if you're the way our plotting minds work, and you know, and it brings me to my question a little bit, you know, you and I, from a lot of fellow writers, and we hear the thing about being a plotter or a pantser, meaning do you plot things? Do you outline when you write, or are you more of a pantser, which is, they say you fly by the seat of your pants and you decide your next chapter is going to tell you, or are you somewhere in between? What would you say you're writing?
Yeah, that's a great question. I kind of straddle the line a little bit on that, because there are what I would consider to be two layers in crafting the story. There's the backstory, which is the secrets of the book. It's kind of who did what to whom and why. It's everything you don't know when you're starting the novel. Typically, I know all of those secrets before I start, so I have a sense of what's really going on behind the scenes. But the other layer of that is, how do you actually unfold those secrets in a way that creates the most emotion and drama and suspense as you go through the book? And that, for me, evolves a lot as I'm actually telling the story. So I still do an outline of how I would expect the action's going to unfold. But as I actually start diving into the writing process and I get the words on the page, it tends to go off in directions that I didn't see coming, and the characters, you know, guide me in ways that I would not necessarily have anticipated. I used to do very exhaustive background sketches on the characters before I started a book, and then I would find that, you know, the characters would basically sort of, you know, poke me in the side and say, no, that's not right at all. Here's what's really going on with me. And you have to learn to listen. You have to learn to listen to that. So yeah, on one hand, I know what's going on. I know the backstory, and yet how I tell the story, I try to leave a lot of spontaneity in that as I go through the writing process.
Yeah, I same thing. I kind of like, okay, this is the story I want to tell, and I kind of usually know, and they're usually, because they're mysteries, thrillers, there's usually a who done it or a big reveal at the end. I
Right.
usually 90% of the time know what that is, but I'm not sure exactly how I might get there. And it's so
Yeah.
funny, in the world of doing television all these years, having done over 200 hours of, you know, dramatic television and everything. It's, you know, somebody sort of said the writing between television and movies and writing books that I learned coming to novels in the last 10 to 15 years and becoming friends with a lot of people, and especially, you know, a lot of our discussions, I have felt the difference feels to me. It's kind of like two things. One, I think I've said to you, if I was ever going to write my autobiography about television, I would say it's not a radio show, right? Because literally it's in front of you. When I started writing novels, I'm going, wait a sec, it is a radio show because there isn't in front of you. You have to create everything for people. To that end, also in television and movies, it's a 1 hour or 2 hour. You have to write into constraints. Your characters, hopefully they make sense in terms of what they're doing, right? But they got to do it in a constricted amount of time, right? As opposed to in novels, I figure, and I used to say there was an old routine that George Carlin used to do about baseball and football. It says in football, it was sudden death. In baseball, it's extra innings, you know? I mean, the difference between the two. And I thought writing for television and movies is like basketball and football, whereas baseball is novels, which is the game will end in baseball when it ends. And so it's kind of like your character in novels that they going, you get to the end of a chapter and you're going, okay, I know where you're going to end up, but where would you go next? You can do that in a novel as long as you keep, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, I love the way the chapters let the narrative unfold. My philosophy when writing mysteries and thrillers is always that I never want a chapter to end the way the reader thinks it's going to end. I always want to be able to pull something out that suddenly shifts the expectations and makes them stop and say, oh, I didn't see that coming. And of course, the idea is, you know, that's what keeps them turning the page to find out what happens next, because now they have to find out where this next secret is leading them.
Right. Harlan Coben once said to me, he said to me, I want you to be really angry at me at 3 o'clock in the morning. When you get to chapter 17, you're going, I need to go to sleep, but oh my God, I have to see what happens next. And then the other
Exactly
thing
right.
that you've done really well in the Bourne books, you know, when you're doing multiple plot lines, right? You get to the end of a story, right? I think this is purposeful, right? You get to the end of something Bourne's doing, and then you're going, oh my God, where do they go next? And then you get to the next chapter and you're going, oh no, now we're following Shadow or Johanna or whatever these people. And
Right.
then get to the end of that, you're going, oh, I want to see what they do. And you're back to Bourne, and suddenly you're and it's 5 a.m. and you're late for work the next day, right?
Exactly right. Exactly right. Yeah. One of my favorite emails from a reader was someone who said that she'd been reduced to taking illicit bathroom breaks at work to get in another chapter. So I thought
that's really good. Now, in terms of writing, what is your, I think people, I know that what is your typical day like when it comes, to writing? I mean, and how do you kind of in terms of writing a draft, how long does it sort of generally take? Is there a pattern you're in, or is it vary?
Yeah, it varies depending on where I am in the course of the book. So right now I just turned in my 7th Bourne novel a couple of weeks ago, and I'm starting in on my 8th Bourne book. So I'm in the plotting stage at this point, and usually the plotting stage involves me sitting in that chair you can see behind me there, and for hours on end with notepads, just writing down different ideas. What if this happened? What if that happened? How does this break something else? What if this happened to Bourne? And just kind of, it's almost like a platonic method of feeding questions to myself and seeing how I might answer these things. And slowly, over the course of several weeks, I see the plot taking shape and coming together. Then when I get into the actual writing phase, people ask him, am I a morning person or an evening person? And I'm kind of a noon person. In the mornings, it takes a while to get me going. So usually what I do is I end up kind of rereading what I did the day before and editing the last few chapters that I've written. By the time I'm through with that process, then the flow of it kind of pours me right into the new material that I haven't gotten to yet. So I find that most of the words seem to kind of get on the page in the afternoons, because that's when I've kind of got back into the flow of the book. And then I love the editing process. That honestly is my favorite part of the whole process. That's when the words are all on the page, and I can just kind of play with everything and get it just right.
And when you start looking and going, who wrote this crap? Going like, it's kind of thing. It's funny because I'm, I think, and generally because I'm on the West Coast, you're on the East, because I'm up pretty early, and I'm one of these people who writes really early, and by 12 o'clock, I've probably put in a good 7-8 hour day when I do it. And then I usually take the next day, I look at what I wrote, and then the next day I write another chapter. And I think it was Robert Caro, the guy who writes the LBJ books. I heard him say a quote once where he said, all I want to do is go to bed knowing what the first line I'm going to write the next day is. And I'm going, I can have that. I feel like, okay, it's not, I don't want to, I don't want to ever wake up and go like, oh, what am I going to do today? Because it's like, what am I going to come up with? Because I'll never, the computer becomes something that's very scary to me. Right? Yeah.
Oh no, exactly. Yeah. The first page of every chapter is always the hardest, because you're setting the scene, and it just, I mean, getting that right, getting the transition right from the previous chapter, setting it in people's mind, that takes, 3 times as long as the rest of the chapter.
And then kind of knowing where you want to end and then where you're going to get to the next day. And then the other thing is, and this has always been like when, television used to be written in acts, or, it's like same thing with books. I think Stephen King said this, right? That he said, if the last quarter of the book, you can't write it in a week or 2, there's something wrong with the first 75% of it. Right. And generally, I suddenly find that, and he also has an expression, you get a take of the God who knows, even though you know how it's going to turn out, you want to see how it turns out when you're physically actually doing it, right?
Yeah.
And there's something very satisfying about that,
Yes.
And now, and tell me a little bit, I think I've asked you this before just in our conversations, but remind me and tell our people listening here, when did you start? Were you always writing, or did you come to it later? Or what was like, growing up, college, in terms of
Well, yes and no. I started out very young. I can remember sitting in 6th grade class in California working on my very first mystery novel. So in fact, all these years later, I can still remember it was going to be a chess themed murder mystery called Checkmate. So I kind of think, well, that might not be so bad to go back to one of these days.
Might be able to, how about a big chess game like in one of the Bourne books, right?
There you go. There you go. Well, and heck, if you look at what's been going on in the chess world the past couple of years, there's a fair amount of skullduggery, it seems like, behind the scenes. But
I remember that great Casino Royale. What is it? What's the game they play? At
the Baccarat one
on the Baccarat table.
Yeah.
Absolutely. That movie, it's fantastic, right?
Yes, exactly. So I started out very young. I've been writing my whole life, but I also, publishing, as you well know, it's such a tough business in which to break in. I actually wrote 5 books in the course of my life before I started in on the manuscript of Immoral, which ultimately became, an international book of the month, my first Jonathan Stride novel, and that was the book that really broke through. So I didn't actually end up, kind of selling and becoming a full-time author until early in my 40s. So, but I always look back and people will ask, well, do you wish you'd broken through earlier? It's like, well, on one hand, sure, but I also feel like life happens in the right timeline and for the right reasons, and I felt like by the time I was writing Immoral, kind of all of my craft experience and all of my life experience kind of reached a tipping point where I was ready to do this, and I was ready to kind of write the books that I was born to write. So.
Right. It's all a learning ground. To me, I think, 10, 12 years ago, I think I've written 4 novels, have finished a 5th, sold my first 4. And I'm going like, God, why didn't I start this early? Because I love it so much. It's my thing. And I'm going, because everything I learned about storytelling, working on cool television shows and running writing rooms and running shows and all the reading, I'm going, yeah, because I was in my 50s when I was writing my novels. If I'd done that in my 30s, none of them would ever sold, because it's what you learn in the process, right?
Yes, that's exactly right. Yep. Yeah, you need not only the writing experience, but you really need the life experience to be able to bring, to really make these characters unfold and have them really come to life on the page.
Now, do you get, like, I think I know the answer to this. You don't get to read as much as you want, obviously, right?
I don't. Yeah, that's been kind of the only downside to breaking through as a writer is boy, it's hard to read suspense the way I used to. And I wrote 3 novels last year, so it was when you're writing suspense all day long on those kind of deadlines, curling up with somebody else's suspense novel at the end of the day, it starts to feel like work more than entertainment. You treat it as market research. Oh, I like that. I think I would have done that differently. Oh, I see where he's going with that. So.
Yeah, so watch like an 8-episode streaming thing over a week or 2. So that's your version of a novel these days, right?
There we go. So. Well, so let's see. Are we? I see. Yeah, I see.
Yeah, Brian, so we're at the 45-minute mark. So Scott, if you want to transition to audience questions, we have 5 audience questions in the Q&A already. And if folks have any other audience questions, please get them into the audience Q&A. Thanks, Scott.
Well, yeah, okay. So here's a couple of questions to start. I see. Is there any plan to bring any of Brian's Bourne series to the big screen?
Well,
something you and I chat about a lot.
I was going to say that's a conversation that feels pretty familiar. We are certainly of the same mind that should be happening. The Ludlum estate owns the Bourne series, and obviously, as you well know, it's such a complicated process to get anything on the screen. But to me, the timing right now is so perfect to have, particularly the idea of a Jason Bourne, streaming series. We've got Jack Reacher, we've got Jack Ryan. These things have been so popular, so successful. Exactly. It just seems like Jason Bourne would be the ideal focus for a streaming series, and hey, we've got a bunch of great stories waiting to come to life.
No, it's funny because Brian and I do talk about this, because we've become really good friends over the last, really during the pandemic. It's funny, we talk like once every couple of weeks, every month, or and we have the Stride things, which we have a script that we're trying to get set up, and we have talked about the Bourne books. Part of the problem, and we have our agents working together to figure this out. There are all these plans still in the back of the movie world where they're still talking about making another Bourne movie, whether it's Matt Damon adjacent, we don't know. But we're also at the same time, like you said, the Tom Clancy, we're the opinion, like they did the Jack Ryan with Krasinski on Amazon at the same time they were doing the Chris Pine, last Ryan. They can exist in two different worlds. So it is something we would love, me and Dan, my partner, and Brian would love to try and sort of, we were just talking about this morning, and I was talking to our agents this morning, that this is something we want to make 2025. Let's get an answer if at least you're interested in possibly doing that, because we would love to do that.
Yeah, and on all the this is Massachusetts libraries here, so all you Bostonian folks, talk to Matt and talk to Ben, get them on board here. So
yeah. Let's see, Brian, do you find that some of your books sell better than others, and if so, can you find the reasons?
Oh boy, that's an interesting question. Sure, I think. The Bourne books sell very well. I think, Bourne is such a well-known, famous character. I think that, as a result, I think those books get a lot of attention. For me, to some extent, I don't pay that much attention to what's going on the sales side of things, just because I don't like to feel like I'm being guided by the sales success in terms of what I want to write next. It's funny. I write very, very different books. I obviously have a long-running detective series with Jonathan Stride. I've got several very, very different standalone novels, and everyone's completely different. I've got several books that are female first-person narrative. I've got a couple of books that almost graze a little bit on sci-fi. And I always tell people that if people are kind of wondering, well, what's my brand as a writer? And I always say, well, I kind of want to be the Tom Hanks of the thriller world. That when it comes to Tom Hanks, you never know what he's going to do next in terms of movies and characters. He's got so many wildly different characters in the movies that he does, and yet if you see his name on the marquee, you know that you're going to get a great experience, and you're going to get pulled into whatever the story is. I hope people end up feeling the same way about my books, is they won't necessarily know from book to book what I'm going to do next, but hopefully if they see my name on the cover, they know they're going to get a rich reading experience.
I think there is a commonality in all your books. What's interesting is that there is a moral compass, moral center to whoever you're writing about, right? These are immediately from page one, I feel like you're rooting for whoever you're writing about, whether they're a cop in San Francisco, a cop in Minnesota, a spy who doesn't know who he is, or somebody who's chasing after his, doppelganger self, right?
Right.
It's literally, and I feel like, it's funny, like same thing. It's like, I'm an unabashed Stephen King fan, right? And, love his horror books, but he also loved, things like Shawshank, Mr. Mercedes, and then The Dark Tower. And to me, my first two books, one was a horror book. The second one was a kind of an emotional sci-fi book. And then these detective novels, which I've read tons of. Well, King, to me, writes all three, mostly for horror, but there's some commonality in all those. At its core is one or two or a group of characters that you are taking on an emotional, moral journey. One of the questions we all are asked as writers is, I always say to me when we're coming up with, whether it's an idea for a new TV series or a plot of the week, why now? Why are we reading it? Why are we writing about this character at this point in this moment, right?
Yeah, I think that's, I think at heart, if you're not writing about a character that the reader will feel engaged by and emotionally attached to and want to spend time with, I think they won't get as involved in the book as you want them to. Ultimately, I think they need to feel a connection to that character and an emotional connection. I always say it's kind of funny. Every book that I write, even the Jason Bourne novels, which are action thrillers at the core, if I'm not in tears myself sometime during the writing process, then I feel like I've somehow failed because I haven't gotten so intimately connected to the characters. I always want to feel like there's some scene that just kind of makes me break down.
It's so funny that you say that, because my wife will come in and see I'm working on something, and I'll be like all misty-eyed. She goes, "Oh my God, you're pathetic." That you're laughing and understanding why. Then she reads it, then she gets all teary-eyed. I'm going, "Oh, see, success, right?"
Exactly.
Here's a question: do you prefer to write in silence or with background music?
Oh, wow. Interesting question. Most of the time in silence. I will say though that I much prefer writing outside. I spent decades in Minnesota. Marcia and I moved down to Florida a couple of years ago, and I now find that other than the peak of summer, I do most of my writing outside, and I love that. So it's not really quiet in the same way, but there's something about the writing in the outside air that is very energizing. I really enjoy that. The one time I want music is if there's music going on in the scene. So if I'm writing a chapter where there's a certain kind of music playing in the background of the scene, then I'll typically be listening to that music while I'm writing the chapter. So it kind of, I'm capturing what the characters are feeling.
Yeah, it's funny because I know, like, to me, I usually have music on when I'm writing, and the big thing is like I'll have like an album or two on, and I go like, God, I just missed 5 songs, and I'm going, that it's like great that it's sort of pushing me forward. And then, but I do know when I'm reading, it's the one time I can't have music on, and I think it's something about when you're pushing right, in your thoughts out onto the page, the music's pushing it there, but they're kind of working at cross purposes. When I'm trying to read something and concentrate, it's like I can't have 2 things coming into my head at the same time.
Right. I agree with you. Yep.
In terms of that. There's other one more. Let's say, if you cannot be a writer, what do you think your occupation would be?
It's funny. I did I did an event last year. It was a with a group of blind writers. It was a Zoom event, which I thought was a little strange, but they said, well, you don't need to worry about makeup or anything. But they asked me a great question. They said, when did you first think of yourself as a writer? And the honest truth is, I have never thought of myself as anything else. As I mentioned, I was working on mystery novels back in grade school. I have always seen the world through the lens of storytelling. If you read my novel, Thief River Falls, the heroine, Lisa Power, is a thriller writer like me. And she talks about it the same way, that she sees the world differently as a writer, and she sees this extra layer of characters and drama happening beyond what you actually see in front of you. So that's a question I have no answer for. I cannot imagine a world where I'm not a writer. All I know is if I were not, I certainly would not be as happy as I am.
Yeah, I think the same thing. I've always wanted to tell stories, and grew up in a family that was in the movie business, so stories were something I always saw, and they were mostly producers. So I kind of wanted to do my own storytelling, but I realized the way to do it was come up with my own stories. So that was
right.
Yeah,
and you learn when you listen and hear from readers the power and impact that stories have on people's lives. I mean, when I get emails from readers who have had the love of reading rekindled by reading the books, or they're in the hospital dealing with the loss of loved ones or challenges, and the books lift them out of their current circumstances for a little while and take them somewhere completely different. There's no experience like feeling like you've made a difference in people's lives that way.
And I know we're almost done here. So, but one of the things that also, just to mention, so we know the Bourne Vendetta comes out a week from tomorrow, right?
Yep.
And then talk a little bit, Breaking Every Rule, which was that was the last book that came out, right?
Yeah, Break Every Rule is a standalone thriller that came out last fall in September. It was my 30th published novel, and I wanted a book that kind of, where the hero sort of combined some of the best qualities of Jonathan Stride, my detective character, and Jason Bourne, and so it's a great action thriller, and yet very much, I think, a story of redemption, as this man Tommy Miller tries to find his missing wife, and is forced to discover that they've been keeping secrets from each other to try to protect each other, and that's what they really need to get past. Later this summer, my next Bourne novel, The Bourne Escape, will be coming out. That'll be in late July. And then I have a wonderful little psychological mystery called Photograph, and that's going to be coming out in September or October of this year. So it's going to be another busy year of book launches.
Let's see. I think, are there any other? Have any of Brian's other non-Bourne books been on the big screen?
Not yet, not yet. But Scott and I are working on it. So
yeah, we got introduced to each other, like I said, at the start of the pandemic, and we have so much in common about what we like, what we, the writers we like, the way we like to write and tell stories. So I kind of figure like it's my mission to get, one, two, or a bunch of, Brian's stories on the screens, because not only will people enjoy them, then Brian can write more books that will do even better because people want to read the books that they're watching the shows of. Right?
There we go.
Robert, I see you lurking there. Are we sort of towards the end here?
Yeah, I think we can start winding it up or winding it down. Actually, I wanted to just give an opportunity. Brian and Scott, did you have anything you wanted to say to the audience before we wrap it up? Any last words?
Well, I just want to say, Scott, thank you so much for joining me tonight and being part of this conversation. It's always a pleasure chatting with you, and I really appreciate your being a part of this event tonight. And I want to encourage everybody, check out Scott's novels as well, particularly his most recent novel, Should I Fall? We talked about engaging characters. I just find all of the characters in Should I Fall are so engaging. You really just want to spend time with them. So, check out Scott's books. And Scott, thank you so much. This has been great.
I mean, I love chatting with you, and how our friendship has, grown over the last few years. And thank you. You've been such an advocate for my books, and I'm really proud of that. And and if you were going to check that out, I would even say check out The Last Commandment first, because Should I Fall is the follow-up to it. But again, I think what I really wanted to do there, same thing, was created a thing that if you read Should I Fall and like it, I think you'll want to go read The Last Commandment. So anybody who wants to go do that, that would be great. But and Robert, thank you for inviting Brian, and Brian inviting me. I think this is marvelous what you guys are doing. How many authors you have, your fans being introduced to. I think it's so great that they can interact even with questions like this.
Yeah, it's a terrific series.
Yeah, thank you, Brian. Thank you, Scott, for the kind words. Folks, let's give Brian and Scott a big virtual round of applause for a wonderful conversation. I'm kind of reading between the lines, but hopefully in a couple of years, we'll have a Jason Bourne streaming TV series with Scott, as one of the writers. That would just be wonderful. And Scott, I'll ask you off air all my Dean Stockwell and Scott Bakula questions. But folks, look for an email from me tomorrow with a link to this recording and information about Brian's new book, which is available next Tuesday, not tomorrow. Sorry about that. But I'll have information from Wellesley Books about that, as well as this recording and information about some other upcoming virtual author visits that might be of interest. So please, for those watching live, go ahead, Brian. Yes. And to all you folks that joined us tonight live, thank you so much for spending time with us and sharing the evening with us. That is just terrific. Readers are what keep writers like me and Scott going. So we are so grateful for your enthusiasm and participation. Yeah, good words to end on. And folks, make sure to take the 60-second feedback survey when I end the Zoom in a moment. So thank you all so much. And I hope everyone enjoys the rest of their night. Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Scott. Good night, folks.